I thought I could endure it, every detail, every word, every glance. But the more time passed, the clearer I realized how brutally wrong I had been. He was my brother, she was my sister, and they were all part of a game I never wanted to play but got caught up in. It wasn't just a choice, it was the moment when my own people, those I loved, those I admired, began to tear apart the world we all built, and not for me, but for some foreign ideal. I didn't care what they thought, I didn't care how they saw me, and especially, I didn't care what I was about to lose. But, essentially, that was just the beginning. I grew up in a small town, in a modest two-story house with my parents and my older sister Rachel. She was just 2 years older than me, but it often felt like we were living in different worlds. Rachel's world was filled with light and attention. She always managed to be at the center, no matter what the circumstances. I, on the other hand, was the one who stayed in the shadows, whose life seemed completely different, a little less bright, though perhaps that was just my perception. My father owned a small cafe that provided us with everything we needed for a comfortable life. He was a simple, hard-working man, and every day he brought home his share of cares and joys. My mother, who always took care of the house, occasionally helped out in the restaurant, but most often she stayed out of the kitchen, creating a cozy atmosphere in our home. Life wasn't luxurious, but we didn't feel deprived. There was enough warmth, attention, and work to feel neither poor nor rich. Rachel was always the center of attention. I remember how my mom praised her once after a school event when she came back full of joy, holding her award. "You're going to achieve so much in life. You're just so talented," Mom said, and I stood in the doorway, quietly holding my certificate from the science fair, but my accomplishments seemed nothing compared to hers. Rachel was always in the spotlight. Her success in school Olympiads, her excellent grades, her presidency in the debate club, all of it was a source of pride. Meanwhile, I, with my B's and my role as treasurer of the environmental club, seemed to never deserve a mention. It's not that my life was bad. No, everything was fine, but in our house, it was understood that Rachel always came first, and her achievements became the subject of endless conversation. One day, while folding laundry, Mom told me I should think about more practical career options. She said it calmly, as if there was nothing unusual about it, but those words stuck with me painfully. Practical options meant something like working in retail or services. It was her way of saying that I probably couldn't expect anything more, and that word, practical, was like a knife to the heart. Mom didn't realize how deeply it cut, though I had already gotten used to these subtle hints, to being not like Rachel. Rachel always got the best things. When she got the latest iPhone, I got her old one with a cracked screen. When she wore designer clothes, I got her second-hand ones. Every family gathering became a showcase of her achievements. I remember Dad telling our relatives about her SAT scores, boasting about her successes, and Mom couldn't stop glowing as she talked about Rachel's future. They said she would get into one of the best colleges in the city, and everyone expected that her life would only begin when she got her chance. I sat quietly at the table, not intervening in the conversation, and tried to imagine what my own celebration would be like in 2 years. But I knew it would be nothing like Rachel's. I tried, I put in the effort, I studied, I took extra courses, but it all seemed to matter little. When my moment came, the answer was merciless and cold: "We can't let you go to college. You're not cut out for it," Mom said with contempt, and I felt my dreams shatter before my eyes. I asked, "What about the money I saved for Rachel?" My question went unanswered, and Dad merely cleared his throat awkwardly. Everything was different. Rachel had a clear path, exceptional grades, clear prospects. And I, apparently, was made for something else. Perhaps for working in the cafe, which seemed to be the only viable option for me. I stood in the room, unable to believe my ears, unable to believe what I had just heard. I could work and study at the same time. I begged, repeating that I could pay the money back with interest, that we could borrow from relatives or take out a loan which I would repay in installments, and I would arrange everything through a lawyer if needed. Please, just help me start. My voice was filled with desperate pleading, but Mom was adamant. We never take loans, Vanessa, and we're not going to change our principles for you. You have to accept your limitations and find a suitable job. Those words hung in the air like a heavy stone that I couldn't lift from my chest. I went to my room, unable to say another word. In the silence of the night, I cried, feeling the emptiness grow in my heart. But the tears gradually turned into something else, determination, a rebellious desire not to give up, not to stop. I knew I had to find a way. I went to those who always saw me for who I truly was, those who loved me unconditionally, my grandparents. In their old house, in the kitchen smelling of baked pies and fresh tea, I opened my soul. Tears mixed with my words, but I kept speaking, not hiding my pain and despair. I can't just give up on college. I can't, I repeated. Grandpa's eyes were filled with anger and sadness as he listened, but he didn't push me away. We don't have savings, dear, but let me think, he said. He fell silent, lost in thought, and I, despite the bitterness, felt a small ray of hope flicker inside. My grandchildren's dreams will not be destroyed like this, he said, and his words became a vow. The following weeks were a real roller coaster of emotions. Disappointment when the bank rejected our loan application alternated with unimaginable shock when Grandpa announced that he was selling their old house. He sold the plot of land where they had lived their entire lives, and the money, though barely enough, was enough to cover my college tuition. I applied for a degree in investment management in a city as far from home as possible. My family didn't believe in me, and I wanted to go as far as I could to escape their shadow. When I left, Mom and Dad didn't come to say goodbye. I stood at the bus stop, and only Grandma gave me a tight hug, while Grandpa, trying to wipe away his tears, pretended nothing was happening. I remember that moment as if it were yesterday because that's when I finally cut all ties with my parents. All I had left was my determination and their support. In their now smaller home, I felt that their sacrifice for me was not just money, it was love and faith that they had never given me before. For years of hard work, late night studying, and reviewing materials flew by, and I finally received my diploma in investment management. With my diploma in hand, I returned to my hometown, full of big dreams and a determination to achieve what had been denied to me. But reality turned out to be much harsher. The job market wasn't particularly friendly to new graduates, and I spent weeks sending out resumes with very few promising responses. There were no jobs, and I could feel my dreams starting to melt away. Finally, I got a job at a small trading company, which was nowhere near the prestigious investment firm I had dreamed of. It was just the beginning, nothing more. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, nothing special, but it was mine. My own, paid for with my own hands, my life. And it was at that moment that the unexpected phone call came. Rachel. She hadn't called in a long time, and her voice on the other end of the line sounded unexpectedly sweet and warm. Long time no talk, you should come to dinner this weekend. I'd love to catch up. I froze, unsure of what to think. It was unexpected, but I thought that maybe time had changed everything. Perhaps now that we were adults, we could finally build the relationship that had never existed before. I couldn't have been more wrong when, that evening, I arrived at Rachel's house. From the moment I walked in, I could feel that I had walked straight into a trap, set with cold, calculating precision. Rachel's parents were there, along with her boyfriend, a polished guy in an expensive suit who barely noticed my presence. His gaze was distant and detached, as if I was nothing more than decoration for the evening. The interrogation began as soon as we sat down at the table. Rachel's mother raised her fork and, staring at me, began her tirade. "Tell us about your job," she said, her voice sounding as if she had already decided I could be compared to something lowly. I hesitated, but replied, trying to hold my ground. I work at a trading company, I said. It's small but stable. I tried to keep control, trying not to let those words sound like an excuse, but Rachel, without waiting for me to continue, interrupted with a bright laugh. A trading company? You mean one of those discount stores? Her voice was mocking. Honestly, you don't need a higher education for that kind of job. Anyone can just walk in off the street and get hired. She looked at me, as if concluding the conversation. I could feel the air around me grow heavy. She continued, it's not the same as working at Citibank like my mom, and nodded toward the woman sitting across from her, who smiled proudly. Or being a lawyer like Thomas, a lawyer from Anderson and Pierce. Rachel's boyfriend gave a smug nod, casting a glance at me full of disdain. Rachel's mother smirked, sipping her wine. I've always told you, darling, that college is a waste of time and money. All your grandfather's property should have been used more wisely. Her words were cold and stern. Her father added with a sneer, swirling his glass, hey, maybe I could hire you as a waitress. You know, with your education, we could really surprise people at the cafe. Everyone laughed, except for me. I sat in silence, unsure of what to say. My face turned red with shame, but I stayed quiet, gritting my teeth. Inside, a wave of hatred began to rise against these people who had never believed in me. Well, where do you live now? Rachel asked, and her question sounded like a challenge. I looked at her, holding back my fury, and quietly replied, I found a place on Cedar Street. In response, there was a collective sigh. Cedar Street. Rachel gasped. Her eyes widened, and she barely contained a laugh. Vanessa, that's literally the worst neighborhood in the city. You know, people like you live there. The poor. Her words rang out like a slap. I felt everything inside me tighten, as if someone had twisted my heart. Mom whispered in her ear, yes, the poor, and they all laughed again. Something inside me broke. Everything I had tried to build seemed to be collapsing right before my eyes. These people would never change. I stood up so abruptly that the chair scraped across the floor. My fingers clenched around my handbag until it hurt. You know, I'd rather be poor than be like you. I spat out the words, not thinking about how they would sound. At least I'm my own person. I don't live off my father's money or rely on anyone's patronage. My breath was heavy, and my heart beat so hard that it felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, ignoring their protests and accusations. As I stepped out into the night, I promised myself that this would be the last time I ever stood in their presence. I didn't need them. Life has an uncanny way of surprising you when you think everything is over. I continued working at my small trading company, but I felt like I was stuck, hitting dead ends no matter where I turned. And then, one day, out of nowhere, the phone rang. It was Gemma, my old colleague, my roommate from college. Her voice on the other end was full of excitement. She could barely contain her joy. Vanessa, you won't believe what I found out. Do you remember how we always talked about Maxwell Investment Group? They're opening an office in your city and are looking for fresh talent. My heart raced. This was everything I had ever dreamed of. Maxwell was one of the biggest names in investment management. This wasn't just a chance, it was the opportunity one had been fighting for all these years. I spent that night updating my resume, and the next day, I prepared for the interview like never before. When I walked into their temporary office, I felt that everything in my life had been leading to this moment. All those extra hours spent working, all the research I'd done in my free time, it had all paid off. A week later, they called me, and I knew I was ready. I was in my element. I threw myself into the work, absorbed in a neutral sense of purpose that had now become part of me. While everyone else left the office at 5, I stayed late, immersed in studying new investment strategies, reviewing every proposal and every number to ensure their perfection. My attention to detail, my ability to perfect my work, became my weapon in the battle for success. People began noticing my efforts and results. "Vanessa, you're clearly cut out for this," my manager said during my 6-month review, and I couldn't help but notice the genuine respect in his voice. In response to the praise, he not only complimented me but also offered a bonus that was larger than my entire annual salary at my previous company. That moment was significant. I stood on the threshold of real success. But that wasn't enough. The bonus, the praise, it was all just the beginning. I understood that the real game was just starting. And I was ready for it. I took on bigger projects, building a reputation as someone who could turn failed investments into gold mines. The results came quickly, my bonuses continued to grow, and I already had a clear plan for every cent I earned. I knew where I would invest my money and how I would multiply it. After 2 years at Maxwell Investment Group, I decided it was time to take the first major step into my new life. I walked into a luxury car dealership. The salesperson probably thought I was lost among the shiny cars, but when I pointed to their top model and said I'd take it, his face instantly changed. An hour later, I was pulling up to my grandparents' house. I saw the gleaming new car parked in front of their house, and when I handed Grandpa the keys, his jaw dropped in surprise. But I didn't stop there. My next step was just as ambitious. I closed a deal for an apartment in the Heights, the city's most prestigious new development. The apartment had floor-to-ceiling windows, marble countertops, and a view that made me feel like I owned the entire city. One morning, as I was leaving the building with a cup of coffee in hand, I heard a familiar voice. "Vanessa." I turned around and saw Rachel standing in front of me, in her designer tracksuit. Her face was twisted in a mixture of confusion and surprise, as if she had seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" she asked, clearly shocked to find me in her world. I slowly took a sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "Oh, I live here," I replied casually, pointing to the penthouse floor. "I just bought it." The expression on her face at that moment was priceless. I could see envy in her eyes, for the first time in my life, for the first time when Rachel couldn't hide her reaction. In her perfect eyes, I saw a genuine emotion that wasn't laced with sarcastic laughter or the cold disdain she had always shown me. A week after that encounter, my phone rang. On the screen, my parents' number appeared, which was already surprising, as they hadn't called me in years. Even more surprising was that they were in the neighborhood and wanted to drop by. I agreed, more out of curiosity than any desire to change anything. When they entered my apartment, their expressions were straight out of a textbook. Mom looked around, her gaze darting from the panoramic windows to the designer furniture. Dad, standing in the hallway, looked awkward, as if he was afraid to touch anything. It was rather amusing, though also a little bitter. Mom finally ran her finger over the marble kitchen counter, holding back an admiring glance. "It must be going well for you," she said, her surprise clearly showing. I responded dryly, offering them a seat on my Italian leather couch. I could feel their presence growing heavy, as they tried to figure out who I was now and what my life had become. And perhaps at that moment, they realized I was no longer the person they had once known. I was no longer the same. They exchanged looks before Mom, slightly clearing her throat, began her speech. "Well, actually, we have some news," she said, as if searching for the right words to soften what she was about to say. "Rachel is engaged to Thomas." I felt something tighten in my chest. My sister, who had always seemed so out of reach, was now walking down a path that had once seemed unattainable to me. She announced it last month, at the engagement party. Of course, I wasn't invited. It was expected, but no less painful. Mom continued, her voice gradually taking on that familiar tone of grumbling that I remembered from childhood. "They're planning the wedding in 6 months. We offered to pay for half the costs, as is customary, she said, but in the next moment, I could feel the atmosphere in the room becoming tense. Dad awkwardly shifted in place, but it seemed the budget was in order. $300,000. I almost choked on my water. $300,000, an amount that seemed utterly incomprehensible to me. That number hit my consciousness, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Mom, as if responding to my inner shock, quickly explained, Thomas's family has certain expectations. They're very influential in society, and we promised to cover half of the costs before we knew the amount. She fell silent then, casting a meaningful look at me. So now, you need $150,000. I rolled my eyes and finished her sentence for her. I'm not giving you the money. Mom beamed, not noticing my cold response. Since you're doing so well living in this beautiful apartment, working at such a prestigious firm, you want me to give you the money? I responded firmly, alone. My gaze was cold, confident, and I saw how Dad, intervening, tried to calm me down. We're asking for a loan, of course. We'll pay it back. We'll even make it public. We know it's a lot. Mom quickly added, but we can't back out now. It would be so awkward in front of Thomas's family. They expect a certain standard, just like when I wanted to go to college. I interrupted her, unable to hold back my anger. You're talking about standards, Mom, but where were your standards when I asked for help with my education? Where were you when I asked for help? Dad, awkwardly looking away, tried to intervene. Be reasonable, Vanessa. But I stood my ground, feeling my anger rising inside me. Reasonable? I exclaimed. You called me unworthy of an education, offered me a waitress job instead of helping me. You let Grandpa sell his property to help me while you gathered the money that you so generously give to Rachel. Mom objected, your money, that's unfair. I sighed, feeling everything inside me boiling. No, what's unfair is that you've only come to me because you need something. In response to her objections, I opened the door and said firmly, I don't give money on loan. I believe that's a family tradition, right? Mom's face turned red with anger. How dare you throw our words back in our face after everything we've done for you, she shouted. I laughed bitterly, feeling the weight of their demands spill out. Done for me? I repeated. Please, leave. Mom continued muttering something about ingratitude, while Dad avoided eye contact. When I closed the door behind them, it felt like a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I stood in front of them on my own terms, in my own home, from a position of strength, my strength. The next day, my phone rang again. This time it was Rachel. What's wrong with you? Her voice was cold and gleeful. She didn't even bother to say hello, as if I owed her something that needed to be discussed. She immediately got to the point. How can you be so selfish? I leaned back in my office chair and stared out the panoramic windows at the sunset. Everything around me seemed so small, so ridiculous, and I felt so strong and independent. Selfish? Is this wealth coming from you, Rachel? I replied, as if shaking off all their manipulations. We're family, Vanessa. Family helps each other. You have money, everyone knows you're doing well. Why don't you help with my wedding? I almost laughed at the absurdity of her request. It was all so trivial. How about when I was at your house and you called me poor? When you laughed at where I lived and mocked my job? Was that different because I was family? Rachel objected. We were just teasing each other, and now you're being ridiculous. I waved her words away. No, what's ridiculous is that none of you have spoken to me for years until you needed something. If you need money so badly, why don't you ask our parents? They're your real family. They've made that clear over the years. Rachel exploded. You think you're so much better than us now with your fancy apartment and your big job. You're still the same pathetic little sister who was never good enough. The line went dead, and I was left alone, feeling a sense of relief. I sat there, stunned and shaken, realizing that her words no longer hurt me. They just exhausted me. I stood by the door, motionless, watching my sister, who clearly expected something different. Rachel had always been like this, able to play with emotions, manipulate with a silent confidence that sometimes mesmerized. But now, at that moment, I felt nothing but tiredness from her usual manipulations, from the way she brought up the same old issues just to pull me back into their whirlpool. I didn't want to be part of this game anymore. "Do you really think I'll help you?" I asked, watching her try to keep her self-satisfied face, but her eyes betrayed everything. She was nervous. It was easy to tell. Rachel bit her lip, sighed, but still didn't give up. "Vanessa, you understand how important this is. You don't want us to be embarrassed. You don't want everyone to think we can't organize a proper wedding. You've always said that family is important to you." I tilted my head, and my smile was cold, almost indifferent. Family. How much I had heard about that word, and how often it turned out to be just an empty shell, into which everyone placed their own interests. She could say anything, but I no longer believed in those beautiful words that hid only expectations and demands. "You're talking about family, but if you really cared about me, you wouldn't have come here with this offer," I said calmly. "You wouldn't use me to solve your problems." In silence, she sat on the edge of the couch, nervously spinning the ring on her finger. I saw her lips tremble slightly and understood that she still hoped for help. But the longer she sat there, the more I wanted to close the door in front of her and never open it again. "Vanessa, you can do this. You're wealthy, you have everything. What's stopping you from helping me?" Rachel lifted her gaze, which now showed not just fear, but also desperation. I felt a slight relief. Perhaps it was cruel on my part, but I knew I could no longer carry this burden. My life was not meant to serve as a backdrop for someone else's ambitions. And the more she spoke, the more I felt my attachment to this house, to these people, fading away. "You don't understand, Rachel. I've helped you all these years. I kept thinking that one day things would change, that I would be a part of your life. But all you've ever done is demand, and you've never given anything in return." I paused, letting my words sink in. "So, if you want me to help, you'll need to rethink your whole strategy." Silence hung in the air. Rachel looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something like regret in her eyes, but it quickly disappeared. Her smile faded, replaced by a face full of resolve. "So you won't help?" "No," I answered firmly. "I won't give you the money. Not to support another one of your illusions." Her eyes flashed, and maybe she wanted to say something, but she stayed silent. Then she stood up and headed for the door. As she was about to leave my house, I heard her quiet voice from the hallway. "You've made your choice, Vanessa. It will be easier for everyone this way." I didn't respond. Closing the door behind her, I was left alone once more. And although she left without getting what she wanted, I knew it was time to finally break all these chains. In this life, I was not meant to be just a part of someone else's expectations. I don't care how you impress Thomas's parents. I don't care about your perfect wedding, and I certainly don't care what anyone thinks of you anymore. "You're making a huge mistake," Rachel said, her voice trembling with rage. "You'll regret this." I smiled, feeling a strange, almost pleasant sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, I felt space open up in my chest, as though the weight I had carried all these years had suddenly dissolved. "No, Rachel," I answered. "For the first time in my life, I'm absolutely certain I won't regret it." Only a few days had passed since my sister's visit, and as it often happens, the world didn't slow down. My phone rang again, and the name Sarah, a college friend I hadn't spoken to in a long time, appeared on the screen. She had always been kind and supportive, and although we hadn't crossed paths in a while, I knew she still cherished all the memories that made our college years unforgettable. Sarah wrote that I should know what had happened the previous evening at the country club. I felt my fingers momentarily tighten on the screen, unable to resist wondering what she was about to share. Your parents finally confessed to Thomas's family, she wrote. They could no longer avoid the wedding planner's calls. According to Sarah, it was quite a scene. I could vividly imagine it, the elegant dining room of the country club, Thomas's wealthy parents in their impeccable attire, and my father and mother standing in the spotlight, realizing they couldn't even afford a fraction of the wedding costs. It must have been humiliating, the moment when their truth was exposed in front of everyone. Thomas's mother, Sarah said, literally turned crimson with rage when she realized her sparkling plan was falling apart. Orders for luxurious floral arrangements were cancelled, the honeymoon suite in the Maldives was cancelled, and the vintage champagne was replaced with something far less refined. In the end, Thomas's parents agreed to cover all the expenses themselves, but the damage had been done. The wedding went ahead, but its grandeur was far from what had originally been planned. My name was not on the guest list, and honestly, I hadn't expected it to be. My grandparents, upon hearing about the wedding plans, received an invitation but, seeing no point in attending, politely declined, citing previous commitments. They spent that Saturday with me, having a picnic in their backyard, avoiding any mention of the event. When the wedding photos, as expected, appeared on social media, I found myself scrolling through them with a glass of wine in hand. Rachel, in her expensive designer dress, looked like a true princess. Thomas stood next to her, smiling stiffly, surrounded by his parents, who at that moment seemed as expensive and static as the decorations in the picture. My parents, in their new outfits, likely bought on credit, couldn't hide their discomfort. Their smiles were forced, and their poses awkward. Thomas's parents appeared in several shots, their expressions ranging from barely concealed contempt to open displeasure. In one particularly telling photo, Thomas's mother looked at my parents with such a look that it was typically reserved for something unpleasant found on the sole of someone's shoe. Sarah continued to send updates, telling me how life after the wedding was unfolding for Rachel and Thomas. They had moved into a house his parents had bought for them, but my parents rarely visited. Soon it became clear that their behavior did not match the high status, which turned out to be so important to Thomas's family. Sunday dinners, once a family tradition, were no longer part of their plans. Every day, I felt more and more how these people were becoming strangers to me. I hadn't spoken to my parents or my sister since the wedding began. It was hard for me to believe that we would ever return to the time when something connected us. I doubted we would ever find common ground again, but sitting in my apartment, watching the sunset paint the city sky in shades of gold, I made a final decision. I came to terms with the fact that some bridges, once burned, must remain as ashes.